Well, my clock says 7 o'clock, so I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. And so we'll go ahead and get started. And if there's some other folks that join in with us, then that's great. We'll let them in. We'll let them in out of Zoom purgatory, otherwise known as the waiting room. And they can uh, tune in with us. So. Well, first I want to say welcome and thank you for coming tonight and for being interested in this portion of this, the second information session that we will have done. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time once we begin to just do some brief review before we get into talking about the protocol of separation and what that exactly means. And so before we get into any and all of that, it's appropriate, I think, that we would begin with a word of prayer. So if you join me in a prayer, let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you so much for your church. We thank you, oh God, for the body that you have called into being to be your hands and feet in a lost and hungry world. Pray, oh God, that as we come to talk about issues that are facing your church, that we would always keep in mind that you are the head of the church, that you are the one who is in control, that you know before we do how things are going to turn out. And we know, oh God, that this isn't something that is new to you, but you have seen it all, and you are present with us and present with those that will be making important decisions. So we pray that you bless our time tonight, and that you would just watch over us, and Lord, that your spirit would just pervade our conversation, and that you would be glorified through all that happens tonight. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen. So, okay, well, very good. So just like the last time, the purpose of what we're going to do tonight and the purpose of this presentation is just to present some information. My inclination or my purpose, I guess, in doing this isn't so that we can have great debates and hash it all out and figure it out here at the local church level at Trinity. But my purpose in doing these sessions was so that people would have an idea of kind of what's happening in terms of the general church level, the denominational level, or what we call the general conference. And so I thought it was important for the church not to be taken by surprise. And I certainly recognize that there's some of you all, this is kind of old hat in review, and you probably know more than I do. There's some of you all that are hearing some of these things for the first time, and some of the terms and some of the events that have been happening are just kind of a whirlwind. So we come from all different places, and that's okay. We'll try to figure it out together the best we can. So what I kind of have planned for tonight is to spend a little bit of time just reviewing what we talked about the first time, which was mostly about the timeline of how we got to this place. And then I want to introduce to you what we call the protocol for short. It's I think well, I'll say, I forget the exact title of it. I'll save it for when we get to it, and I can read it and not butcher it right now. And then last time we heard from, and I showed a video from Tom Berlin, and I have another video from Tom Berlin in which he explains the protocol. So I want to show that. I want to spend some time then working through some of the specifics, and then just have some time for you all to ask questions, and I'll do my best to clarify anything that's not clarified in the presentation or in the video. So that's our plan for tonight, and that's what we will go ahead and do. So to review from session one, which we had, I guess it was back in November, seems like many months ago now, but we started off sharing some definitions that can help us think through all of these issues. So we talked about things like the incompatibility clause, which you might remember is that clause that's in the Book of Discipline that says that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with scripture and Christian tradition. We also talked about kind of some of the different groups that we have. Progressives centrists, traditionalists. Those are kind of the terms that are used, and whether we want to use labels or not, those are the convenient labels that are used. I also spent some time just looking at, and for some of you it was review, for some of you it was the first time, hearing about the structure of the church and how it is that what we call our general conference, which is the worldwide body that comes together once every 4 years, is the only group that can speak officially on behalf of the church. They're the only ones that can change our book of discipline. So we talked about that and how that relates to annual conferences and districts, and also to the local church. We then spent some time going all the way back to 1972 to see how this issue has been an issue at each of the general conferences to one degree or another. And we have seen in recent years how that issue has really come to the forefront, probably more so with it being even a political or an issue outside of the church, as well as restrictions from a secular law standpoint have changed, allowing for same-sex unions and recognition of rights that homosexual people have. And so the church in relation to that has wrestled with these questions maybe a little bit harder. And so we did all that last session. Also, we spent some time looking at some more recent events. And so I just wanted to just refresh your memory and kind of what has happened in the last 5 years. We're not going to go back and cover everything that happened in 1968 and 72 and 86 and all that. So let me just refresh your memory. This is just review again. In 2016, there was a general conference. That was one of the times that they met. And the bishops appointed a commission that would come to be known as the Commission on the Way Forward. They were to come back with a plan for a specially called general conference that was to happen in 2019. They basically came back with two plans. They came back with more than these two plans, but these were the two plans that kind of had any traction. The first plan was called the One Church Plan. You might remember me talking about that. The One Church Plan, this basically was a plan, and this is really a quick summary of it, to allow clergy and annual conferences and local churches to choose their own stance. So basically it was kind of like, okay, well, if your church wants to allow same-sex unions, then fine, your church can do it. And if your church wants to accept a person of homosexual nature as their clergy, you can do that. Kind of let people decide for themselves. It was the plan that was supported by most of bishops, and also we could also, I think, say most of the U.S. delegates, United States delegates. The other plan that had momentum was what was called the traditional plan. And again, just a quick summary of the traditional plan that they would bring forth out of their meetings after a year and a half was the traditional plan kept the current language, which would be the incompatibility language, but it went a step further. Not only kept things the way they were, but kind of, you might remember I had talked about, there was quite a bit of, what you might say, persons that were ignoring or refusing to enforce the provisions in the Book of Discipline. And so what the traditional plan did is that it not only kept the language, but then added language that would give mandatory penalties. It said, this is what has to happen. It's not up to a discretion of a district superintendent or a bishop. This is what has to happen. That plan was supported by some of the United States delegates, but it was mostly supported by the non-United States delegates. Person from Africa, Korea, Europe, the Philippines. And you might remember that the last time I talked about how it was that because the United Methodist Church is a worldwide church, we have people from all across the globe that participate in this general conference that makes these decisions. And so what has happened is that the persons that come from outside the United States tend to take a more conservative or traditional view, more orthodox view of things. And so they tend to be more traditional. So it makes sense that they would have supported the traditional plan. It's this plan, the traditional plan, that passes in 2019, right? And talk about 2019, that wasn't long ago, hardly. So that plan passed in 2019. Problem with this, and you'll hear Tom Berlin say the same thing, is that the vote ended up being, I don't know, it was like 53 to 47 in favor of the traditional plan. So clearly there was no consensus that came out of it. There was no majority besides a simple majority of 51%. And so while it helped us to have some type of plan moving forward, it certainly didn't address the issue for many people. And it didn't bring unity, that was for sure. And immediately after the passage of this plan, for those that disagreed with the plan, it was a difficult thing. And there was lots of pronouncements that people were going to disregard the discipline, disregard the action of the General Conference. And so basically, we were back where we started. We had kicked the can down the road, as some people say, for a couple of years. We had this commission, spent all these thousands of dollars, and then now we're back to the same spot. That brings us up to date to then what we're talking about tonight happens. And so what happens is, after that special called General Conference in July of 2019, in Chicago, there's a special meeting that is called together. It's actually called together by an African bishop who has since passed away. But he called together basically people from all of the different interest groups in the church. So people that supported the traditional understanding that was in the Book of Discipline, people that vehemently disagreed with that, people that were in the middle. And he brought together stakeholders from all of those. And so it started off with 3 central conference bishops. So central conferences, those conferences outside the United States. It also included 3 traditional people that had their views were traditional, 3 people that were in the middle, centrist, and 3 people that were progressive. They ended up holding 3 different meetings in October, November, and December. This is 2019. They end up inviting a mediator, Kenneth Feinberg, who Tom will talk about his background. Kenneth Feinberg, you might look at his name, you could tell he's not United Methodist. He's not a Christian. In fact, he's Jewish. So anyways, that's kind of interesting to note. And Tom Berlin will talk about that in the video. Out of that group, they come to announce, I think it was around this time last year, the beginning of 2020, a plan that will come to be known as a protocol of reconciliation and grace through separation. That's the handful that I was trying to spit out earlier that was difficult to say. So the protocol of reconciliation and grace through separation. So for short, we just call it the protocol. So this protocol, and we're going to talk about the details tonight in a little bit more, basically allows for what the term that's used is amicable separation, or more friendly separation, with traditionalists and possibly others able to create a new denomination. But as they do that, and we'll talk about this later too, they'll be able to keep their property. That's what is the amicable part of it. Kind of the, you go your way, we'll go our way. And so it allows for the formation of other new denominations. It will also allow for what we know today as the United Methodist Church to continue, but it will be called a post-separation United Methodist Church. It's thought that that group will call a general conference. If this protocol is approved, that they'll call a general conference pretty quickly and change language of the discipline to relax some of that language, that incompatibility language. to make it more permissive. When this first came out, this agreement received widespread support, mainly because of the diversity of its members. So up to this point, there had been other plans that have been suggested, but many of those plans came from particular interest groups or particular camps, if you will. So the traditionalists had another plan that was a plan for separation, and then progressives had a plan to change the Book of Discipline, and so, but here was a plan that held great promise in many people's views. So this plan, this protocol of reconciliation, grace through separation, was scheduled to be voted upon this past spring in Minneapolis. Minneapolis was to be the site of the General Conference, and we know what happened. This little spiky ball, right? So, of course, they were scheduled to meet in May. March was when things began to shut down. As you can imagine, having a worldwide meeting with people flying in from all places and trying to get the passports and all of that stuff straight, it takes a little bit of planning. You just can't turn on a dime. And so the persons that make these decisions at the General Conference level, I think it's called the General Conference Commission, decided that they would postpone the General Conference in May and move it to the end of August, beginning of September of this year, 2021. And so, so that's the plan moving forward of when that we'll vote on it. I want to move us now to over to Tom's video, and some of you saw Tom the last time if you were on the call or watched the recording that we did of this whole presentation, of the first presentation. And Tom is the pastor at Flores United Methodist Church in Herndon, off of the famous Frying Pan Road next to Dulles Airport. And Tom is a wonderfully gifted pastor, and even more than a pastor, a leader. And Tom has been a part of that. He was part of the commission that brought the Commission on the Way Forward that brought those plans initially. Tom also was one of the ones who met in Chicago. He ended up representing the, just so you know his background in case you're wondering, he represented kind of the middle way, if you will. So he wasn't representing the traditionalists, he wasn't representing the progressives, he was kind of in the middle. And you'll hear that in his talk. He does a real good job of trying not to go either way and just present the facts, so to speak. He's more like kind of Walter Cronkite, if you will, just the facts, the news. And so, anyways, that's a little bit about Tom, and we're blessed to have him in our conference and to have him in the doing these things in the general church as well. And so I'm going to move out of the PowerPoint. If you just give me 1 minute, I'll go ahead and bring up the video. Good to see you all. Now that I can see everybody at one time. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, well, I thought this might happen, but that's okay. There's more than one way to skin the cat, as we like to say. I love cats, actually. We got 4 of them. I wouldn't skin any of them. That was in one browser. That was in Safari. I'm going to try it in Chrome here and see if it works.
My name's Tom Berlan. I'm a pastor at Flores United Methodist Church in Herndon, Virginia. And I'm here to talk to you.
Can everyone hear that?
Yes,
See?
I
Okay.
can.
About the protocol legislation that's pending before General Conference. You may be wondering, as many ask, Tom, why are we even talking about this? Didn't all this get resolved? And so let me take you back. In 2016, at the General Conference, the Council of Bishops created the Commission on the Way Forward. over the globe, United Methodist leaders who came together thought about two questions. Would the United Methodist Church offer services for same-sex couples, marriage services? And would we begin to ordain self-avowed practicing homosexual persons who are qualified for ordained ministry? Those two questions have been pending before the General Conference for many years, and those are questions of LGBTQ inclusion broadly. The commission was given a charter. It was told, give the church as much unity as possible. So our job was to create a unity plan, a way that we could all live in this together, even though we had different opinions. That plan was called the One Church Plan. And the One Church Plan was brought to a special called General Conference in 2019, which was just a year ago. And in 2019, when the One Church Plan came forward, 47% of the General Conference delegates voted for it, and 53% of the General Conference voted against it. And so it didn't pass. Now, the Commission on the Way Forward had also talked about other plans. And one of those plans was called the Traditional Plan. It was brought forward. And 53% of the delegates, remember, we're in a global church. So these are people from all over the world. Here in the US, about half of them are here in the US, and then the rest around Africa, especially the Philippines and Europe. 47% voted against the traditional plan. Now, the traditional plan was not like the provisions that have been historically in the Book of Disciplines around not having same-sex marriage offered in our churches and not ordaining persons. It actually created penalties for clergy who did those ceremonies. And it had other penalties as well. And so it felt very different to a lot of people. Now, the difficulty with this close of a voting margin, and that margin held throughout that 2019 General Conference, is that it is definitely a victory for the traditional plan, but it's not exactly a mandate. In other words, it doesn't have enough broad support that people leave feeling resolved. And in the years since, people have not felt very resolved about this. In fact, some in this side have said, you know what, we're going to actively resist that. And many of the people that are on this side live in the United States of America and other parts of the globe. But this side also are people in the United States, less than the amount of people here, but also in the continent of Africa and places where people hold very traditional views on same-sex marriage and the ordination of gay people. And so that leads us to the 2020 General Conference, where once again, these issues are coming before the General Conference. So if you're wondering, why isn't this done? Didn't you take a vote? That's why. The matter is simply not resolved. Now, back in August of 2019, Bishop John Yambasu, who's a bishop in Sierra Leone, Africa, he began to really feel the calling of the Holy Spirit to call a meeting. He actually felt that right after General Conference, which was in February. By the time August rolls around, he's invited some other Central Conference bishops. Those are bishops in places like the Philippines and Africa and Europe. And he said with them, you know, maybe we could convene a meeting with Americans, because largely this is where the tension is the United States. And so he said, maybe if I brought together leaders who are traditional leaders in what's called the Reform and Renewal Coalition, maybe if I brought centrist leaders together in renewal groups in that center space, maybe if I brought progressive leaders, maybe if I brought them together, perhaps we could think of something that would actually bring us a sense of resolution instead of conflict. Because in truth, the 2019 General Conference was a very conflicted space. No one left that experience feeling good about it, I think is fair to say. So Bishop Yambasu brought that group together in August. It was a difficult meeting because those people all disagree on these matters. But the meeting had enough promise that a subset of that larger group met together again in September, now adding some US bishops to their number. And that group decided to continue talking. They decided that they needed a mediator, someone who would be an outside person who could help the group process the situation that they were trying to resolve. And so we talked to different people. I was one of the people in that group. And suddenly a person arose that none of us really expected. His name was Kenneth Feinberg. Mr. Feinberg is a well-known mediator in America and even around the globe. He settled some major difficult cases. The BP Deepwater Horizon spill, TARP, the too big to fail situation on Wall Street, the 9/11 fund, the Hokie Spirit Fund, Volkswagen, on and on. I could give you frankly, any of the major mediation cases in the United States in the past couple of decades, Ken Feinberg has been the heart of the resolution. You know, he's not a United Methodist. He's not a United Methodist. In fact, he's Jewish. But when he met with us, he said, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it for free. And some of us wanted to know why. What he said is, you know, I've checked into you all. You're about roughly 12 million people around the globe, and you do really good work. You do things that matter. He knew about Imagine No Malaria and what we had done there. He knew about our hospitals and our schools and the work we do here in the United States, but also those things abroad. And Mr. Feinberg said, because you matter, I'm going to do this, and I'm not going to charge you. And if I travel, I won't charge you for that. Not one penny was going to be paid. Now, the group of people at that table who sat around in that mediation, they had no authority. They were volunteers, and they collected themselves. Bishop Yambasu invited us to the meeting, but we were just doing it on our own. We also we realized we had no budget. Like we paid our own way. We got ourselves there. But we had a strong sense of calling. And the sense of calling we had was this: we've got to help the General Conference find a solution that will actually help the church experience peace in these matters. And that's what we sat down to do with what was called the protocol. Now, after we wrote this protocol, which is about a 6-page document, we realized we had to write legislation. What I'd like to do now is give you a very high-level summary of the protocol legislation. When the protocol team met, it made a decision from the very beginning. This was not going to be a call for unity and trying to figure out the intricacies as the commission on the way forward had tried. This is going to be different. It was going to be about gracious separation. How could we part, but part in a Christian way? How can we part with a blessing? That was the idea. And so we realized pretty quickly there were going to be 3 separate entities. There would be the United Methodist Church. The Methodist Church, United Methodist Church already exists. It's going to exist, although it'll exist in what we call a post-separation form. That's after all of this settles out. There would be 2 other groups. On this side, there might be a more progressive Methodist denomination. We call it other in the protocol legislation because we didn't have a progressive group saying we want to do that yet. But we wanted to make provision for it should that arise. Second, we said there would be a traditional Methodist denomination. Members of the Reform and Renewal Coalition said, you know, we think we'd like to have this opportunity to create that domination. And so that's what we talked about. Now, each of these 3 groups would need to have a distinct legal existence. Now, what does that mean? This United Methodist Church already has a taxpayer ID number. It's already a nonprofit, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. So it's got a legal existence. These groups are going to have a legal existence to qualify for the provisions of this legislation. Each of them will need a minimum of 100 churches. Why 100 churches? Well, it needs to be large enough that they feel sustainable and vital. You know, Methodists are by nature connectional, so we want to have enough resources to share clergy and other factors. And so minimum 100 churches is a good, healthy start. That's what the thinking is. Now, here's what everybody has to agree to. To qualify to be this or this, you have to be Methodist. And how do you know if you're Methodist? Well, you have agreement on the doctrinal standards and what we call the general rules of the United Methodist Church, of the Methodist Church. This goes back to John Wesley. This isn't new. It's in the Articles of Religion of the Methodist Church. It was in the Confession of Faith of the Evangelical Brethren Church. If you open the first part of your book, that's where you're going to find this. It includes Wesley's sermons and notes. It goes all the way back to John Wesley, who's the founder of the Methodist movement. This is our core theology. This is not being debated. Now, some might say, oh, that is in debate, but it's really not. That's what the protocol team agreed. To qualify to be this or this, you had to agree to this. Likewise, the United Methodist Church are in our Book of Discipline. That's not in dispute. This is who we are. But what is different? Well, we can imagine in a post-separation United Methodist Church, there will be a variance of opinion around same-sex marriage, a variance of opinion around the ordination of qualified gay people. So we could imagine a church where all pastors can perform a same-sex marriage, and some will. People would like to exercise that ability now, but they're restricted by the Book of Discipline. So in this post-separation, we can imagine that But we also can imagine more traditional pastors who are going to say, you know what, I can live in here. I can live in a space. Am I required to do that? Well, the Book of Discipline already protects you in that way. Pastors already decide what couples they'll marry and what couples they won't. No one can come dictate that to you. Now, we can imagine in this traditional space that none can. It'll be against the rules, the same way it is in the United Methodist Church under the traditional plan. And none will, which is to say, people aren't just looking for rules, they're looking for agreement and conformity to rules. And so here, none can, none will, here, all can. And we can imagine in this more progressive space, all can, very much like this, but in this space, probably all will. Why? Because again, it's not about rules, it's about what people are really trying to express and do. This gives a space of high agreement. This gives a space of very high agreement. This gives a space where people sometimes disagree, but they agree to be in community in the midst of some of that disagreement. This is a lot like the church I serve today. I don't know if it's like your church or not, but it's a lot like the one I serve. And what I love about that is there's space in that community to have a variance of opinions. Now, there is no vote required. So if you're in an annual conference that doesn't want to talk about this and doesn't want to vote on it, great, continue as you are, and you don't have to vote. Your delegates to annual conference don't have to vote. And if you're in your local church, you're not going to have to vote unless you really want to. So I'm going to tell you about that in just a minute. But first, I want to tell you about some financial aspects. On this side, we agreed a $25 million allocation from the United Methodist Church would be made to start this traditional Methodist denomination. On this side, we agreed there'd be a $2 million allocation that would be given to start this denomination. Now, I know what you're thinking probably. That's a lot bigger, you know? Why so much? Well, the reason is it's a matter of indexing. The protocol team really thought about this and realized there are many more traditional United Methodists who may choose to depart. And there are organizations that have been working on this for many years to think about, you know, how might we live together? And so this $25 million is an allocation to start that denomination in a more healthy and vital way. Now, likewise, there may be people who want to leave here, but probably a smaller amount of people, but $2 million is a lot of money. And it's to start that side with health and with vitality. There's also an allocation in the center in the United Methodist Church. That allocation is for $39 million, and it is earmarked. It's funds that are currently in our budget, but they're going to be earmarked for an 8-year period. These ministries that are supported by this $39 million are for and by Asian, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, Pacific Islander communities, and Africa University. Now, why would we earmark this? Well, when a large organization like the United Methodist Church goes through a time of financial turbulence, it is sometimes tempting to say, you know what, the smallest groups, those on the margin, we're not going to allocate any money there. And that just felt completely unfair. And so what this 8-year earmark does is it says, we're going to make sure that we continue to support these ministries. Now, of that 39 million, 26 million is coming from the United Methodist Church. 13 million was, the group here said, you know what, we'll put 13 million there. This number is still whole. It's not a subtraction of that number, that's whole. But 13 million represents money that wasn't placed here that will support ministries here, and that this group might be able to say, you know what, maybe we'll apply for a grant, or maybe we can connect in the future in that way. Now, in the United States, these are groups that historically have been people that have felt the marginalization of racism. And so that's a really important group. But can I tell you, these groups, they're also the future here in the United States. I can speak of this context. This is the future of our church as we become an increasingly diverse society. If we don't figure out how to reach those groups of people and help our churches become more diverse, we're going to have a very limited effectiveness in the United States of America. So in many ways, this is an evangelism allocation. It's thinking about what church do we want to be in the future down the road. Africa University is included because on the continent of Africa, Africa University, which United Methodist, established many years ago, is a leadership engine, and it provides leadership in so many ways by training professionals in a college education. And so those are 3 budget allocations. Now, I want to show you, let's assume that you're in one of these spaces and you're in an annual conference or a church and you're thinking, you know what, I bet that we would want to vote. Again, no votes required. But what if I wanted to take my annual conference property, and what if I wanted to join a more traditional denomination or a more progressive denomination? Well, here's what would happen. At your annual conference session, a delegate could stand up, approach a microphone, be recognized, and say, I move that we make a vote to join a more traditional or a more progressive denomination, Methodist denomination, one of these 2 spaces. If 20% of the delegates at that session agree to that motion, then a vote will be made. Now, it doesn't have to be made at that moment. It'll be scheduled, but it does have to be made in a reasonable amount of time. In fact, if you go to the protocol legislation, you can see all the timeline that's built into that. You would have to reach an agreement level of 57% at an annual conference session to leave. That's what the legislation says. Now, you may ask, where did 57% come from? Well, more traditional people wanted it to be a simple majority. That's about 50 plus 1. More centrist and progressive people in the protocol team said, no, this is like a constitutional amendment. It should be a supermajority, a 66%. You'll notice that 50 to 66%, 57 is about right in the middle. That's where that number came from. Now, let's say that the annual conference votes itself to leave, but you're in a local church. What this means, and this is a historic thing, this legislation relaxes what is called the trust clause. In an annual conference, the trustees hold all the property, the camps, the conference center, all those assets in trust for the denomination. Likewise, in your local church, because you're in the United Methodist Church, your local church has property and the trustees hold that property in trust. Now, let's just say that your annual conference votes to go either here or here. All the local churches are going to go with them. Now, clergy are going to have to vote and decide, or not vote, but clergy are going to have to decide where they want to end up. That's in the legislation. You can read that for yourself. But this local church is going to have to decide, do I want to stay with my annual conference here? Do I want to stay if my annual conference voted to go over here? Maybe I want to remain in the United Methodist Church. Well, that's when your church doesn't have to vote, but it can. So notice what we're doing here. We're giving you the ability to vote, but not the requirement to vote. But if you make a vote, you can take your local church property with you. And so you could vote yourself and out of this space into this, or out of this space. Likewise, if your annual conference remained United Methodist and your local church said, actually, we're more progressive, we want to go over here, you could vote to do that. You could vote to come over here if your annual conference stayed here. Again, we're giving people options. We're giving people the ability to self-differentiate. Now, how would a local church do that? Here's the answer. A local church would vote by first having the church council decide, are we going to vote or aren't we? The church council, which tends to be a smaller group in the life of the church, but it's the leadership team, would say, you know what, we're going to take a vote on this. And they could choose whether that would be a simple majority or 66% of a called church conference. In a church conference, every member present is able to vote. So all of your professing members would meet, they'd all gather together, and then they would take a vote, and the church council would say it's either a simple majority or 66%. So the protocol team tried to give your local church the ability to make some decisions that are best for you. That was our goal. Now, in the midst of all this, there was one other really important thing that I want you to see. All parties in the protocol team agreed that in this legislation, we wanted to build in a moratorium on all complaints and charges on LGBTQ matters. The reason that we did this is we want to lower the temperature of this whole conversation. And there's a lot of frustration and friction and anger around charges that have been brought against people for performing same-sex marriages and for other matters related. And some bishops, some bishops are going to enforce that right up to the full measure of the law, other bishops less so. So we said, why don't we just take that pressure off the whole system? Let's just put a moratorium until from the time the legislation is passed at General Conference until the post-separation United Methodist Church meets. We'll have that moratorium in place, which will help everybody just think clearly, talk without the tension, and enter into a dialogue that might be a lot more productive. You may be wondering, why is this so important that we're going to talk about it at yet another General Conference? And there are a couple of reasons for that. First reason is this: we're talking about people. LGBTQ people are members of our churches. They're our family members, our friends, our neighbors in the community. And so we're trying to make sure that the church isn't at a constant impasse over these two important issues about people. We're trying to find a way forward to deal with that. Now, no matter what we do up here, no matter what it looks like, we have to resolve that impasse. And that's important because in your church and in mine, I have church members whose family members, whose friends and neighbors are LGBTQ people. And so it's for the people and it's for everybody connected. But it's also important to resolve these questions so that we can consider the future of our church in other ways. The United Methodist Church is in need of reform and renewal. And we simply must find new ways to offer that renewal. It would include vital worship, meaningful discipleship, sacrificial and servant-oriented service, our passion for social justice, all surrounded by a willingness to share the love of Christ that would effectively enable people that are far from God to enjoy a relationship with the resurrected Christ and his church. And friends, as long as we are in a protracted argument, we're never going to get to that vitality. We simply have to resolve this. The protocol legislation leaves intact the United Methodist Church for compatibilists, people that are more traditional and more progressive, but have decided they can live together in one space, allowing pastors and churches to remain more traditional or more progressive. The truth is, none of us are purely anything. Most of us are in congregations that skew in one direction or another, and most of us are somewhere in between. This protocol legislation also allows people who are more traditional or more progressive to enter into new Methodist denominations where they can offer Christ in ways that they feel are more helpful and more appropriate to their interpretation of the Bible. I'd like to give you a quote from the protocol legislation where we write this: "The work is important because it provides a pathway of reconciliation and grace through separation. It offers us an opportunity to bless and send one another into a new reality, rather than to continue to fight and rend our way into irrelevance and destruction. We can fight and rend, or we can bless and send." It feels like those are our options now. And the question is whether we want to continue this protracted argument or move into a new day. The team that put this legislation together did so with a desire to see the United Methodist Church and other Methodist denominations to continue to bless and to send people into ministry. And we hope it'll be a great blessing to the delegates of the 2020 General Conference. Again, I want to invite you to read that legislation for yourself. Thanks for letting me give you what I would call sort of a high-level look at the legislation. And I hope it is helpful in your deliberations as a United Methodist and in the United Methodist Church.
Okay, I think Tom always does a great job of making the complex more understandable. So I hope that was the case for you, and that at least gave you a little bit better understanding of kind of where we're at with everything as it pertains to that. So as Tom talks and as the protocol is written, really kind of these are some of the desired results of the protocol as he talked about. I like what he said there in quoting those lines from the legislation about rending versus sending. And so one of the main things about the protocol is it seeks to end the 40 years plus of bickering that has gone on. And Tom didn't stress this as much as I've heard other people stress, but one of the things that has been so hurtful about this whole conversation, or been sad about it all, has been that it has taken the church's focus off of its mission. Not to say that the issues aren't important that we've talked about, but you can imagine when we're spending all our time arguing about this one issue, it takes focus off of making disciples for Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So the hope is that if we're able to come to some peace through separation, that each of those groups that goes different ways can focus on their idea of making disciples. The other thing that the protocol provides for, and again, Tom didn't, he can't cover everything in 25-minute video, but we're not the first denomination to struggle with these issues and then have debate over these issues and have churches that would want to leave over these issues one way or the other. And what we have seen with churches and denominations that have gone before us and have dealt with this issue is that they too, like us, have, our local church, we have our trustees who hold the property in trust, and the conference, the denomination actually owns the property. And so in these other denominations, when a church has left, the denomination has said, well, you can leave, but you're not having the building. Or you can leave and you can have the building, but you're going to pay us $2 million for it. And people said, yeah, but we raised the $2 million 3 years ago to pay for the building. And so all of a sudden you have court cases, right? Local churches and trustees suing the denomination or vice versa. And it gets just real messy, real quick, not a good Christian witness, obviously. So part of the amicability of this potential separation, and you might have heard Tom say it, is that church decides to leave and votes according to the protocol and the legislation laid out in the protocol, no matter which way it goes, traditional or more progressive. And if they do make that decision, they can take their property with them. So it avoids this whole property conundrum and fight that other denominations have gone through before us. I think of like the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians and even some others, Lutherans. So that's a key thing to know about the protocol. It does allow, of course, for some shared possibilities moving forward. As Tom was saying, everyone kind of agrees to those baseline articles of religion and Wesley sermons and things like that. But what he didn't get into the weeds of is things like, well, what happens to pastors' pensions? As pastors are concerned with that. And basically what's going to happen is that no matter what happens in terms of churches leaving, they're going to continue to pay into one big pension thing. So there's also the hope of, one of the things that's most grievous about the possibility of this thing passing is that some will say it will dilute our missional effectiveness. What I mean by that is, I take great pride in that when there's a disaster across the world, that UMCOR, United Methodist Committee on Relief, is one of the first ones, if not the first, church agency to be there to provide relief to those affected, say, by a natural disaster, and they're often the last to leave. Part of the reason why we can do that is because we have 12 million people together. We pay our apportionments. It funds that type of thing. When we don't have that unity together, someone say that's going to lessen our effectiveness in things like that. So the hope is that it doesn't shut the door to people cooperating. So that possibility still exists, but it will be different for sure. It will be different. So some questions moving forward. As we think about the protocol, as we think about General Conference in August and early September, is one question. It might be, what is the current level of support for the protocol? So I mentioned earlier on that there was, I would say, I don't know if votes had been taken, but or polls, I should say, but seemed to be a widespread support as that this was the most hopeful of any of the plans that have come forward to this point or that will be on the docket come the general conference in August, early September. Many of the groups that participated in those initial meetings that the African bishop had called together have still voiced support up to this point for this legislation. Remember, it's going to be the delegates who vote, right? So, groups can say all they want, but, a lot of those delegates belong to those different groups. So there has been some kind of rumblings, if you will, from some of our brothers and sisters in Africa that look at part of the protocols as not taking seriously their situation, and some concern about funding for the African church. In many ways, the African church has relied on funds from the United States to be able to do some of the things that it's done. And so there's some concern there. And of course, you're never going to have 100% unanimity no matter what. So there's still, there are some folks that don't support it and or have questions. And so anything can happen at General Conference. But if I was a betting man, I would say right now, if there was a vote to be taken at General Conference, that this would pass from my perspective, which is, I'm not Tom Berlin. I'm not talking to all these people and rubbing elbows with them, but from what I've read and heard and listened to, and this would be my thought. Another question is that's currently in the news of United Methodism is, will there even be a general conference in August and September with the virus? Again, we are, hopefully looking a little bit more hopeful, at least in terms of vaccine rollout here. I don't claim to be an expert to know when we'll reach the certain vaccination levels or when, large groups will be able to meet again. And so there's a distinct possibility that those who make these decisions will make another decision about whether this will happen in person or not. There has been some talk of possibly doing it virtually. That presents its own logistical hurdles when you have people from across the world with, not the greatest internet, if you will, trying to connect. You can imagine those outside the United States might feel a little bit out of a disadvantage to do a virtual thing. And as we saw at our own annual conference, just trying to do an annual conference session, that first time we did it, it didn't work out too well. So that's a huge question that's out there on the table right now. And part of that question is that if the General Commission on the General Conference that makes those decisions decides to postpone again, there's a lot of persons, particularly on the traditional side, as well as on the progressive side, that their patience has worn thin, so to speak. There's the thought that you might see somewhat of an exodus of churches, pastors from the United Methodist Church if it gets kicked down the road, even if it's not because of a decision to kick it down the road, apart from because it's just COVID and persons are wanting to move forward. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see if that would come to fruition. But those are some of the questions between now and August, beginning of September, that are swirling out there. Will the protocol continue to receive support, and will there even be a general conference at all? And if not, what is the result of that? So what we'll do the next time we come together for our last session is spend some quality time really saying, well, what does this mean for our church? What would it look like? I'm going to go back and I'm going to share with you in a minute a website that's a resource that if you want to go ahead and read the actual legislation yourself, you can. But we would talk about, if this passed, what would that look like for Trinity in terms of, what would the timelines be? What would the options be for the church? How would it typically play out? What happens if the protocol doesn't pass, and all those types of questions. I want to share with you one website that I thought it's actually where I found Tom's video and a lot of other great information. And it's actually a website in Northern Virginia, in the Arlington and Alexandria districts. They share some resources, including some of their staff. And there's something called that Arlington and Alexandria by district website. And this is it. It's that https://novaumc.org/GC2020. There you can go and you'll see Tom's video if you wanted to go back and watch it. There you can go and they have different links there, buttons it'll take you to the General Conference website for the August and September meeting. They have a website for that. It has a button that you can press to read the legislation itself. There's other buttons with resources about this whole thing. I thought they had done a good job of putting together some of those things all in one place, that if you were interested in further exploring, you could do that. And so I would encourage you to do that. So you've been listening patiently for an hour or so to me as a talking head and Tom as a talking head. What points of information can I maybe seek to clarify, or questions that you might have?
So if I understand that if the protocol passes, the idea is some things will still stay across the border, like UMCOR and maybe some of the camps, things like that, will still be supported by all three divisions. Is that how you translated it?
I think the answer to that question, Debbie, is it depends. So there's a couple of places where voting will occur, including at the conference, possibly at the conference level. Remember, you said if somebody gets up at annual conference, right? That's all our Virginia annual conference, all the state of Virginia for the Virginia conference. Somebody gets up and makes a motion to take a vote on, to leave the denomination, if you will, to not be part of the post-separation United Methodist Church, and 20% of the people say, yeah, we should take a vote. Then, they schedule a vote later on, and so forth and so on. So with like the conference, the conference, trying to think of what they own. It used to be that they own Blackstone. Some of you remember Blackstone, okay? So wherever the conference went, then the conference would take that property with them. So I'm not sure about UMCOR, what the future of UMCOR will be under this type of situation. I know, like, let's take Westview on the James. That's these things will need to be figured out. Many of us have a heart for Westview. Westview is owned by the Richmond, Charlottesville, and Rappahannock River districts. There's 3 districts that own the camp. And so figuring out how that all works out, I'm not sure. So I wish I had a better answer for you. And maybe it's out there and I'm just not aware of it. But that's what I can tell you at this point.
Rob, this is Mike. So there is no voting at the district level. It goes from conference to individual churches.
That's my understanding, Mike. I would have to go back and check, but that's a good question. I don't think districts can have the opportunity to vote.
Yeah, it just struck me talking about Westview.
Yeah, right. So.
Yeah, I didn't see that. I reviewed the FAQ
Uh-huh.
document, which is kind of a good summary.
Yeah.
And I specifically noted that there was no district level voting.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Is Chuck trying to say something?
Oh,
Chuck,
Chuck,
you're on
you're
mute.
muted.
Does anybody have a crystal ball that says just roughly what a time frame would be between, say, the protocol passing and the annual conferences decide which way they go, and then the further time gap between there and what the churches decide? Are you talking about just your crystal ball? Does it say a year or so between each of these different phases?
So my understanding, and again, it's just my understanding, is that if the protocol passes in early September and out of that general conference, the annual, so of course the annual conferences usually wouldn't meet until the next June, at least ours, right? Wouldn't meet until the next June. The annual conference could, and I don't know what the process for this is and how this is decided, could call a specially called annual conference if it's so desired. But most likely would probably wait till June is my thought, to deal with any of that if it is going to be dealt with. Remember, you don't have to vote. Might be that nobody brings it up, which I would find hard to believe, or that they don't get the 20% of favor, but they don't have to vote. My understanding at the local church level is that as soon as the protocol passes, a local church can at any time vote, whether the annual conference has voted or not. So that's my understanding. I could, again, be corrected, but that's my understanding.
So Rob, perhaps Tom covered this, but does the church council determine whether or not the local church will vote?
So my understanding is, yes, that's the church council. And so that somebody, at our church council meeting could potentially make a motion to, that our church should take a vote about whether to stay or leave or, go one way or the other. And, I think the interesting thing in question for me, Ben, is I guess we would operate as we would normally operate when, we require 51% of our church council to vote for that. I thought it was interesting. I have to go back and read the legislation that, he was talking about what was the number, 57% of the annual conference would have to vote, of the delegates to the annual conference would have to vote for the conference to leave. I didn't see that opportunity at the local church level.
No,
Local,
yeah,
it's either 50 or 67.
Yeah, 51% or 66, right?
Yeah,
So
the church council decides which one of those, which is interesting.
so I didn't know if church council had the discretion to make it 57. I don't know. And not that it matters right now, of course. I'm just thinking out loud, and.
Well, I was going to actually make a comment about that,
Yeah.
though, because Tom did mention that the church council would decide whether it was a simple majority
Yep.
or 66%.
Sure.
And while on the surface that seems like, well, that's good to give the council that flexibility. I mean, on the other hand, the church council could game this. If you've got some idea of how your members might vote in a called charge conference, well, you could decide which way you wanted how you wanted that vote to be determined, as to whether it would pass or not. And
Yeah.
that
and-
makes me a little bit uneasy.
Yeah, and you saw that. I mean, he even inferred that that was what was happening in their discussions, right? So he was saying, traditionalists wanted it to be 50%, 51%, and then centrists and progressives, he said, wanted to be the supermajority. And so then they kind of met in the middle, so to speak. And so, so that's a distinct possibility, Ben. I think one of the hard pills to swallow with the protocol is kind of the thing that many of us have been trying to avoid, I guess, for the last 40 years for people that have been in that long. And that is to have to make the church, local church, make a decision and divide it. And so, you know, I think, you know, I'd say, you know, maybe getting to talking a little bit more about what we're going to talk about next session, but if, you know, Trinity or any church has to take a vote, you know, there's going to be people that are going to leave because they're not going to be happy with the vote, whether that vote is to stay or whether that vote is to leave. And so, you know,
The same thing at the annual conference level.
Sure, probably so.
Your
Yeah.
local church doesn't have to belong to the annual
right.
conference that you have been belonged to all this time.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, and I think in looking at something, it was the projection, you know, if you have some churches go one way and some the other, that the definition of conferences and districts will likely change to have sufficient numbers. So that'll be interesting as well.
Yeah. I mean, you know, right now we have, I think it's 16 districts. You know, I don't know. I don't have the crystal ball that Chuck was talking about, you know, will there be a bunch of churches leave one way or the other, one side or the other, or will be kind of folks will be just kind of default to, or we'll even get there. We don't know. So,
Yeah, I find it interesting that if you say you're going to stay, you're really staying with the church that's changing the book of discipline from what it is now.
Yeah.
I find that an interesting twist because I would imagine many people's inclination to say is I don't want to change, but in reality, you are changing from what the current book of discipline says. So I find that interesting, but I guess that was part of the give and take on names and stuff. So.
Yeah, and you know, I think as I've listened, some of the more traditional people have actually opposed the protocol because they have said, you know, in essence, why would we leave? You know, I mean, the discipline is fashioned right now according to, you know, what you know they believe and what they you know ultimately voted. So why would they leave and there be a post-separation Methodist church that was by default staying there? And I think it gets back to like you said, the give and take. So keep praying. No matter what happens, you know, it's there's probably going to be pain, but you know, our Lord is still in control, and He is the one that brought, you know, resurrection and life out of death. So as hard as that is, that's what we have to trust in the midst of all this. So, any other questions before we go?
No, thanks, Rob.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all. I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate us engaging it in such a gracious way, and I hope that we can continue to do so in the future. And I'm sure we will. And like I said, we'll do one more of this, and then, you know, I'll probably have some discussion with the council about, you know, what, if anything, we do between. I think the next one for us for this is March, maybe. And so we'll have between March and August to decide what, if any, further things we want to do in terms of education or discussion or that type of thing. So.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the Christmas covenant at some point.
Okay. Okay. Well,
that is mentioned in that FAQ for the protocol, and it can play a role in making things work a little smoother.
Okay. I'm not intimately familiar with it, Annette, but maybe if you don't mind, if you do a little summary for next time, if you're able to be here.
Yeah, if I can find it.
Yeah.
On the web, I got maybe. I'll try that Northern Virginia site. Maybe they have it.
Maybe so. And if you run into roadblocks, let me know and we can work on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
No,
okay. Well, everybody have a great night. Stay well and stay healthy. And